Montana Territory, 1875. The harsh winter winds howled across the empty plains, rattling the loose boards of Asher Xanthos's lone cabin like angry spirits demanding entrance. At 25, Asher had already seen enough of the West's cruelty to believe one thing with absolute certainty: a man survived these lands alone or not at all. Attachments were weaknesses the frontier exploited without mercy. Asher stood on his porch, surveying the modest spread he'd carved from the wilderness over 3 years of backbreaking labor. 20 acres cleared, a sturdy barn built by his own hands, and cattle that might someday grow into a proper herd. All his. All earned through solitary determination after losing his parents to smallpox back east. "Just us again tonight, Duke," he murmured to the black and white border collie at his feet. The dog whined softly in response, as if understanding the emptiness that echoed through their cabin each evening when work was done. Inside, Asher lit the lantern and stared at the sparse furnishings: a rough-hewn table with one chair, a bed with no adornment, bare walls lacking any feminine touch. He'd told himself this was all a man needed, that filling the space with anything more would only multiply his losses when the frontier inevitably took it away. As he prepared his solitary meal of beans and salt pork, Asher's eyes drifted to his father's pocket watch resting on the mantel. Its golden face caught the lantern light, reminding him of his father's final words: "Don't let this land take your heart, son." But Asher had concluded long ago that giving your heart to anything in this wilderness was just asking for it to be broken. The frontier demanded independence, and he'd built his life around that harsh truth. Spring arrived with unexpected fury that year, the snow melting so rapidly that Willow Creek swelled beyond its banks, turning the usual trickling stream into a raging torrent. Asher had just finished mending fences on the north pasture when he heard it, a woman's scream cutting through the afternoon air. He spurred his horse toward the sound, Duke racing ahead. At the creek's edge, he saw the remnants of a wagon, half submerged in the churning waters. A young woman clung desperately to a partially uprooted tree, the current threatening to tear her grip away at any moment. "Hold on," Asher shouted, dismounting and racing alongside the bank until he was just ahead of her position. Without hesitation, he waded in, the frigid water immediately soaking through his boots and pants, the current pushing against his legs with surprising force. "Take my hand," he called, extending his arm as far as he could while anchoring himself against a boulder. The woman's terrified eyes met his, eyes the color of summer prairie sage. Her soaked blonde hair clung to her pale face, and her delicate hands, now red from cold and strain, reached desperately toward him. Their fingers touched, slipped, then finally locked. With one powerful pull, Asher brought her crashing against him, and they both tumbled back toward the shore, the current fighting to claim them until they collapsed on the muddy bank. "Thank you," she gasped between ragged breaths. "I thought I was going to die." Asher suddenly became aware of her closeness, the weight of her against his chest, and awkwardly helped her to her feet. "What in God's name are you doing out here alone?" he demanded, more harshly than he'd intended. "I wasn't alone," she answered, her voice breaking as she looked toward the submerged wagon. "My uncle. He was driving when the bank gave way." Asher spent the next hour searching the creek's edges, but found no sign of the missing man. The woman, Willow Zavala, as she introduced herself, stood shivering despite the blanket he'd wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes never leaving the water. "Miss Zavala, night's coming. We need to get you somewhere warm," Asher finally said, accepting the grim reality that her uncle was likely gone. "I'm 22 years old and have nowhere to go," she whispered, the stark truth of frontier life evident in her trembling voice. "Everything I owned was in that wagon." The proper thing would be to take her to town, Asher thought. Silver Creek was only 15 miles south. He could deliver her to the Widow Johnson's boarding house by nightfall. That would be the end of his obligation. Instead, he found himself saying, "I have a cabin. It's not much, but you can stay until we can search properly for your uncle tomorrow." The look of relief that washed over her face stirred something uncomfortable in Asher's chest, something he quickly suppressed. Willow sat unnaturally straight at his table, her borrowed clothes, his smallest shirt and pants, drowning her slender frame. Her long blonde hair had partially dried into gentle waves that caught the firelight. Despite her circumstances, there was a dignity in her posture that commanded respect. "It was just my uncle and me," she explained, warming her hands around a tin cup of coffee. "My parents died of fever 3 years ago in Kansas. Uncle Thomas was taking me to Oregon, where his brother has land. The mountain passes will be impassable for weeks yet," Asher said. "Even if you'd made it to the creek crossing. We thought we could wait in Silver Creek." She looked down at her cup. Uncle Thomas wasn't familiar with how spring thaws affect these territories. Neither spoke the obvious truth, that such ignorance had proven fatal. "You can stay here tonight," Asher said, already calculating how early he could ride her into town tomorrow. Having a woman in his space felt like an intrusion on his carefully ordered existence. "I'll sleep in the barn." "Mr. Xanthos," she began. "Asher," he corrected. "Asher," she repeated, his name sounding different in her soft voice. "I have no way to repay your kindness now, but I'm a hard worker. I can cook, clean, so if you'd allow me to stay for a week, just until I can make arrangements or find work in town." "This isn't a proper situation," he interrupted. "A young woman alone with a man she doesn't know? I know you pulled me from certain death today," she said simply. "I trust that more than the unknown waiting in town." Asher shifted uncomfortably. The thought of returning to his solitary routine should have been a relief. Instead, he found himself reluctantly agreeing to her proposal. "1 week," he said firmly. "Then we find a more suitable arrangement." That night, lying on hay in his barn, Asher stared at the roof beams, troubled by the strange feeling that his carefully constructed world had just shifted on its axis. By the third day, Asher found himself watching Willow from the corral as she hung laundry on the line he'd never used. Her golden hair was braided down her back, and she'd somehow altered one of his old shirts to fit her better, cinching it at the waist with a piece of rope. The search parties had found her uncle's body 2 miles downstream. The funeral had been brief, attended by strangers showing the frontier courtesy extended to all who perished in this unforgiving land. Willow had stood dry-eyed beside the hastily dug grave, her face a mask of quiet dignity that Asher found himself admiring. Now she moved about his property with growing confidence, humming softly as she worked. Already his cabin felt different, a jar of wildflowers on the table, his meager possessions organized, the floors swept clean. She'd even hung a patchwork curtain made from salvaged fabric across the window. When she caught him watching, she offered a small smile that Asher found himself returning before he could think better of it. That evening, they sat across from each other at his table, sharing a stew she'd prepared that tasted better than anything he'd eaten in years. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked, breaking their customary silence. "My mother," she replied. "She believed a good meal could solve most of life's troubles." A shadow crossed her face. "Though I've learned there are some troubles no amount of cooking can fix." "Loss," Asher said quietly, understanding in his voice. "Yes." She met his eyes. "You know something about that too, don't you?" Asher nodded, surprised to find himself saying, "My parents. For years ago, I came west afterward, thinking I'd outrun the emptiness." "Did you?" "No," he admitted. "But I built something that's mine. Something that can't be taken away." Willow looked around the cabin. "It's a fine start," she said, "though it could use a woman's touch." The statement hung between them, loaded with implications neither was ready to acknowledge. "The widow Johnson in town is looking for help with her boarding house," Asher said, changing the subject. "I spoke with her yesterday." "Oh." Willow's face fell slightly. "That's very thoughtful. It would be a proper position for a young woman," he continued, feeling strangely reluctant. "Room and board included." "Of course." She nodded, her eyes downcast. "I'll speak with her tomorrow." Later that night, Asher lay awake in the barn, listening to the distant howl of wolves. Why had arranging proper employment for Willow left him feeling hollow? It was the right thing to do, the only proper course. Yet the thought of returning to his solitary existence now seemed less like independence and more like isolation. A week stretched into 2, then 3. Each morning, Asher told himself he would take Willow to town that day. Each evening found her still at his table, their conversations growing longer as spring blossomed across the territory. They fell into an unexpected rhythm, Asher tending the cattle and land, while Willow transformed his bare shelter into something that increasingly resembled a home. She'd rescued seeds from her uncle's wagon and planted a small garden. Somehow she'd traded eggs from Asher's chickens for fabric in town and sewed proper curtains. A rag rug now warmed the previously bare floor. "You don't have to do all this," Asher said one evening, watching her mend one of his shirts by lamplight. Willow's nimble fingers paused. "Would you prefer I didn't?" The truth was, he wouldn't. Each small change she made seemed to ease something tight within his chest. "No," he admitted. "But I don't want you to feel obligated because I helped you." "Is that what you think?" Her eyes lifted to his, surprisingly direct. "That I'm here out of obligation? Why else would you stay in this rough place with a man you barely know?" She set down her sewing. "Perhaps because in this rough place, I've found someone who understands loss without needing me to explain it. Perhaps because you've never once treated me as fragile, even after pulling me from that creek." She took a breath. "Or perhaps because I've watched how gentle your hands are with newborn calves, how you speak softly to your horse when you think no one hears, and I believe a man like that deserves more than emptiness at his table each night." Asher felt heat rise to his face, unaccustomed to such honesty. "The widow Johnson's offer still stands," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "Is that what you want, Asher? For me to go?" The question hung in the air between them. The truthful answer would expose vulnerability he wasn't ready to acknowledge. "What I want doesn't matter," he finally said. "What's proper does." Willow's face fell slightly, but she nodded. "Then I'll speak with Mrs. Johnson tomorrow." The silence that followed felt heavier than any Asher had known in his years of solitude. Morning found Asher saddling his horse earlier than usual, a strange restlessness driving him to check the north pasture fences before Willow awoke. The confusion of his feelings demanded physical exertion, something to exhaust his body enough that his mind might quiet. He'd ridden halfway to the north boundary when Duke suddenly raised his head, ears alert. A moment later, Asher heard it too, gunshots in the distance, toward his cabin. Fear gripped him as he spurred his horse, racing back across terrain he'd crossed leisurely minutes before. As he crested the hill overlooking his property, he saw 3 mounted men circling his cabin, while Willow stood on the porch, his rifle raised in trembling hands. "You've got no man to protect you, Missy," one of the riders called. "Might as well put that down before you hurt yourself." "I know how to use this," Willow's voice carried clearly, though Asher could see the fear in her rigid posture. "Boys, looks like we found ourselves a spirited one." Another man laughed, drawing closer. "Maybe we'll stay a while after we clean out this place." Asher's blood ran cold at the implication. He drew his revolver and fired a warning shot into the air as he charged down the hill. "She's not alone," he shouted, closing the distance rapidly. The men wheeled their horses toward him, clearly surprised. One reached for his gun, but Asher was faster, firing a shot that sent the man's hat flying. Duke circled wide, barking fiercely at the horse's heels, adding to the confusion. "This property is defended," Asher called, his voice carrying the deadly calm of a man prepared to kill. "Ride away now and keep living." The apparent leader of the group spat. "Didn't know she had a man. Just looked like easy pickings." "She has a man," Asher answered without hesitation. "And nothing here is easy pickings." A tense moment passed before the leader nodded to his companions. "Come on, boys. Plenty of other homesteads with less trouble." Asher kept his gun trained on them until they disappeared over the ridge, then quickly dismounted and ran to Willow, who still stood frozen on the porch, the rifle clutched in white-knuckled hands. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, gently taking the rifle from her grip. She shook her head, then suddenly collapsed against him, her body trembling with delayed fear. "I thought they were going to." She couldn't finish the sentence. "I've got you," Asher said, his arms tightening around her. "I've got you." They stood that way for long minutes, her face pressed against his chest, his chin resting on top of her head, both processing how quickly their world might have changed. When Willow finally pulled back slightly, her eyes were dry but resolute. "They came because they thought I was alone," she said. "Because there was no man here." Asher nodded grimly. "The frontier attracts predators of all kinds." "Which is why you believe it's no place for love," she said quietly. "Why you think a man must stand alone to survive." The accuracy of her assessment startled him. Had he been so transparent? "It's safer," he managed. Willow shook her head slowly. "Is it? If you'd been alone and outnumbered like that? If I hadn't been here to at least slow them down until you returned?" Her hands rested lightly on his chest. Perhaps the truth is we're stronger together, Asher. Perhaps isolation isn't protection, it's vulnerability. The idea struck Asher with unexpected force. All these years, he believed his solitary existence was a shield against the frontier's cruelty. What if it had actually been an invitation to it? I told them you were my man, Willow continued softly. Was that a lie? Asher looked down at her upturned face, her questioning eyes, the determined set of her jaw, the strand of golden hair that had escaped her braid during the confrontation. In that moment, the wall he'd built around his heart developed its first significant crack. No, he heard himself say. It wasn't a lie. The following Sunday, Asher and Willow rode into Silver Creek together for the town's monthly social. Heads turned as they entered the meeting hall, whispers following in their wake. Asher felt uncomfortable under the scrutiny, but Willow walked confidently beside him, her simple blue dress, sewn from fabric Mrs. Johnson had helped her obtain, making her look like a vision of springtime. People are staring, he murmured, adjusting his collar. He'd rarely bothered with his good shirt before, seeing little point in dressing up just for himself. Let them, Willow replied, smiling up at him. They're simply not used to seeing Asher Xanthos at a social gathering. They're not used to seeing me with a beautiful woman, he corrected, surprising himself with the compliment. Willow's cheeks colored prettily, but before she could respond, they were approached by Sheriff Miller, his weathered face set in serious lines. Xanthos, he greeted with a nod. Miss Zavala, glad you could make it to town. Wanted to let you know we caught those riders you reported. They'd hit 2 other homesteads east of here. Anyone hurt? Asher asked. Henderson family wasn't so lucky, Miller said grimly. Found the father shot dead. Mother and daughter. He glanced at Willow and didn't finish the thought. We'll need you both to testify when the circuit judge comes through next month. The news cast a shadow over what should have been a pleasant afternoon. As the sheriff walked away, Asher felt Willow's hand slip into his. It could have been us, she whispered. But it wasn't, he answered firmly, squeezing her fingers. We protected each other. The music started, and couples began moving toward the cleared space for dancing. To Asher's surprise, Willow tugged him forward. I don't dance, he protested. Everyone dances, she countered with a smile that made refusal impossible. Under the curious eyes of the townsfolk, Asher Xanthos found himself holding Willow Zavala's waist, awkwardly attempting to follow the rhythm of a waltz. He stepped on her toes twice, apologizing profusely, but she only laughed. My father was worse, she assured him. Mother said he had 2 left feet, both pointing backward. The image made Asher smile, and gradually he relaxed enough to focus on the simple pleasure of holding her, moving together in the crowded hall. The sensation was foreign yet strangely familiar, as if his body remembered something his mind had forgotten, that humans were meant to connect, to touch, to move in harmony with one another. As the music ended, he found himself reluctant to let her go. Later that evening, as they rode home under a canopy of stars, Willow broke their comfortable silence. Mr. Peterson offered me a position in his general store today. Good wages. A room above the shop. Asher's hands tightened involuntarily on the reins. I see, he said carefully. Will you take it? She was quiet for a long moment. That depends. On what? On whether there's a reason for me to stay where I am. The directness of her statement demanded equal honesty in return. Asher drew his horse to a stop, turning to face her in the moonlight. I want you to stay, he said, his voice low but clear. Not as my housekeeper or out of obligation, but because in 1 month you've made that cabin more of a home than it was in 3 years. Because I sleep better knowing you're under my roof. Because, he paused, gathering courage. Because I think I'm falling in love with you, Willow Zavala, and the thought of my house empty of you again is more than I can bear. Willow's eyes glistened in the moonlight. Then I won't take Mr. Peterson's offer, she said simply. Because I'm already in love with you, Asher Xanthos, and have been since you pulled me from that creek and gave me shelter without asking anything in return. Asher dismounted and reached up to help her down from her horse. When her feet touched the ground, he kept his hands at her waist, drawing her closer. I don't have much to offer, he said. Just a small cabin and land that might someday be a proper ranch. You offer everything I need, she answered, her hands resting on his chest. Safety, respect, a partner who sees me as an equal. Asher bent his head slowly, giving her time to pull away. Instead, Willow rose on her tiptoes, meeting him halfway in a kiss that felt like coming home after a long journey. Summer brought changes to the Xanthos ranch. A proper bedroom was added to the cabin, with walls that afforded privacy and a window that caught the morning light. The garden Willow had started flourished under her care, providing fresh vegetables that Asher had lived without for years. Most notably, the cabin gained a second chair at the table, no longer mismatched, but a properly crafted set Asher had commissioned from the town carpenter. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of them. "It's beautiful," Willow said, running her hand along the smooth wood. "A man and woman should sit as equals," Asher replied, watching her face. "Especially when they're to be married." Willow's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "Asher." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small band of silver. Simple but elegant. "I'm not a man of fancy words or grand gestures," he said, suddenly nervous. "But I know that I love you, and that every day with you makes me stronger, not weaker. That everything I thought about needing to face this frontier alone was wrong." He took a deep breath. "Willow Zavala, will you marry me and make this house truly our home?" "Yes," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks as he slipped the ring onto her finger. 1,000 times yes. They were married on a perfect September day, with the aspen trees turning gold in the mountains. The ceremony was small but meaningful, attended by the handful of neighbors and townspeople who had become something like friends in recent months. Sheriff Miller stood as witness, Mrs. Johnson wept happy tears, and even old Mr. Peterson closed his store to attend, bringing a fine china dinner set as a wedding gift. Duke sat attentively beside them, a blue ribbon tied around his collar for the occasion. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the traveling preacher declared. "You may kiss your bride." As Asher kissed Willow, cheers erupted from the small gathering. When they parted, her eyes held a promise that made his heart race. "I have something to tell you," she whispered against his ear during their first dance as husband and wife. "What's that, Mrs. Xanthos?" he asked, still marveling at how right the name sounded. She guided his hand to rest against her still flat stomach. "Our family is already growing," she said softly. "By spring, there will be 3 of us in our home." Asher froze, overwhelming emotion washing through him. "A baby?" he managed, his voice hoarse. Willow nodded, watching his face anxiously. "Are you happy?" In answer, Asher lifted her off her feet in a careful embrace, spinning her once before setting her gently down. "Happy doesn't begin to describe it," he said, kissing her again despite the knowing looks from their guests. "Terrified, overjoyed, grateful, not worried about another vulnerability on this harsh frontier?" she asked, half teasing but with a hint of genuine concern. Asher shook his head. "No, because you've taught me that love doesn't make us weaker against the hardships. It gives us reason to overcome them." He placed his hand protectively over hers where it rested on her stomach. "Our child will have 2 parents who know how to face whatever comes, together." That night, returning to their cabin, now truly a home with curtains in the windows, a second rocking chair on the porch, and the promise of a cradle soon to be built, Asher paused before carrying Willow across the threshold. "What is it?" she asked, noting his thoughtful expression. "I was just remembering how empty this place used to be," he said. "How I convinced myself that emptiness was safer than risking loss again." He looked down at his beautiful wife, her face glowing with happiness in the golden sunset. "Thank you for showing me that a house needs love to become a home." "And thank you," she replied, touching his cheek gently, "for pulling a drowning woman from a creek and giving her the chance to prove it." As Asher carried Willow into their home, the setting sun cast long shadows across the porch where 2 chairs now sat side by side, no longer a symbol of solitary survival, but of a partnership strong enough to face whatever the frontier might bring. The Xanthos ranch would face its share of hardships in the years to come: harsh winters, dry summers, the unpredictable challenges of raising children in the still Wild West. But within the walls of the once empty cabin, now filled with laughter, arguments, reconciliations, and unwavering love, Asher and Willow had created something the frontier could never take away: a home where vulnerability wasn't weakness, but the very foundation of their strength.